So Jesus said, giving meaning to his own story, that unless he left, unless he went through his passion and death, the Holy Spirit would not come, and it was good that the Holy Spirit should come. And the Holy Spirit we might understand as a new kind of knowledge, a new dimension, a new quality of spiritual awareness, spiritual intelligence that is born through the experience of Jesus that we are following in this story. And I'd like to look a little this evening at the way in which the spiritual knowledge, the saving knowledge, as the early Christians called it, a gnosis, a saving knowledge, how this comes about and what are the conditions in which we can be open to it and be transformed, transfigured and divinized by it. I think the first condition necessary for spiritual knowledge is a radical simplicity. And this is one way, one key perhaps to understanding the dynamic of the story of the passion and the death of Jesus, is the radical simplicity with which he passes through these different layers of suffering and loss, moving ever closer towards this core, this radical, simple core, which he encounters in death, and which becomes the point of expansion and effulgence, which is the resurrection. Radical simplicity, then, how do we understand that, and how do we relate to it, and how do we begin to practice it ourselves? Julian of Norwich says that this is really the condition of prayer, the real meaning of prayer. And she calls prayer a condition of complete simplicity, which costs not less than everything. And like the Desert Fathers, when she speaks about prayer, she usually means what we would call pure prayer, or contemplative prayer, or the prayer of the heart, or meditation. A condition of complete simplicity, so radical simplicity, the price for which, or the cost of which, is everything. And this, of course, rings true with the radical call to discipleship that Jesus gives us and gives to his followers, to leave everything behind and follow him, to abandon all riches and attachments, and to enter into poverty of spirit. Or, as we'll see, what John Cassian, teacher of St. Benedict and the key teacher of this tradition of meditation in our tradition, says, he calls the renunciation of all the riches of thought and imagination in the work of meditation. So we can begin, I hope, to see how this experience of spiritual knowledge comes about through this condition of simplicity, a radical simplicity, lived out at different layers and different levels of our experience. Simple is simple, but as we know, it's not easy. We can recognize simplicity in children. It's what we see in the beauty and the goodness and the simplicity of a child's way of relating to the world. We see it in the child's lack of duplicity. Simplicity is simple. Duplicity is, duplicitous or divided. disconnected. We see it in the lack of sophistication or the lack of cynicism in a child. And we would recognize that when a child or when a person loses this simplicity, these qualities of transparency, of trust, of openness, of being present, when we lose that natural capacity, we say we're no longer a child. We've moved, and of course we move into new areas of development, and as Jesus says, we have to learn to be a child again, but we don't learn to be simple in the way that we were simple before. We learn a higher simplicity, one that can integrate all the new layers of consciousness, the new kinds of knowledge which we are now capable of discovering, which a child is not yet ready for. So it's not that we're trying to go back, obviously, to some kind of naivety. That would be a false simplicity. But we are working towards, and it's now quite a hard work, why meditation perhaps is less hard work for a child than it is for us. But we have to accept that harder level of work in order to integrate the new knowledge and the new capacities that we have gained through time, through growing up. We may feel that we're just too old or too troubled or too battered by life ever to be simple again ourselves. We feel a nostalgia, a sadness, maybe even a certain guilt at what we have lost, and a certain sadness that we can never regain it. And then we see exceptions to this. We meet people who are simple and holy. And when we meet them, they lift our spirits. They inspire us, as we can see the world is inspired by the present Pope. And their example maybe reassures us that this higher simplicity, this higher level of childlikeness is actually possible, at least for some people. But we probably feel, well, they're blessed in a special way with a special gift that we have not been chosen to receive. In our loss of simplicity, we feel suffering. We suffer from an increasing overload of complexity in our world. Material, emotional, organizational complexity of modern life. In the business world, endless meetings to prepare for more meetings, over-regulation in nearly all areas of modern life. This chronic attempt to control everything, which inevitably leads to a breakdown of the organic processes in organizations or in groups, fragmentation, which results from an attempt to impose uniformity where there should be diversity, or to allow people to make mistakes, and to accept also that accidents sometimes happen that you can't regulate against. The hopeless task of trying to hold everything together by force, by the kind of power that we were talking about this morning, by imposing our will upon everything. You speak to people in the business world, and not only in the business world, you hear increasing awareness of how organization within complex institutions and corporations breaks down because of an overload of emails, for example. The higher up you go in an organization, the more you see, as they say, how this flood of emails and being copied in on everything that everybody writes, and the avoidance of decisions by writing new emails and copying everybody to sort of avoid responsibility is leading to an amazing degree of chaos and fragmentation. So our loss of simplicity in modern life is pretty widespread and runs through all areas of life. And it has its consequences. One of the major consequences, of course, the dis-ease of stress. One of the major causes of illness, physical illness and mental illness, and also one of the major causes of inefficiency in organizations. The stress, the sense of alienation, the sense that there isn't coherent meaning or a value or a purpose in the work that I'm doing. Many more and more people, I think, feel that the work that they're doing, necessary in order to survive, is actually pretty meaningless. And the loss of joy and true delight as a consequence of increasing affluence. Aware of these consequences, we either distract ourselves from distraction, and in doing so, of course, we make the problem worse, and the addictions that accompany these distractions even worse. I was talking to someone recently who said that he was trying to learn to meditate and really wanted to, and he said, I'm failing. I said, I'm a very bad meditator. I don't do it very often. I'm very irregular, and when I do it, my mind is all over the place. But he said, I'm so grateful for it, because it has shown me something. In fact, he was describing, without realizing it, perhaps the real fruit of meditation, even in his limited application, which was awareness, self-knowledge. And he said, I just become aware of how utterly addicted I am to distraction. When I come in my apartment in the evening, he said, I suddenly noticed the other day that I put on the TV, I put on stereo in another room, I make sure that my computer is on, and I'm checking email and watching the news while I'm cooking my meal. And he said, when I go to bed, he said, the last thing I do as I lie in bed is to check my messages, and I fall asleep holding my phone, and when I wake up in the morning, I'm still holding it, and it's the first thing I check when I wake up. So I think I was very delighted from what he was saying, because he was describing, the emergence of a new knowledge, of a new self-knowledge that he would benefit from, painful though it was. So we either increase our level of addiction, and we become addicted to all these forms of distraction, or at some point we begin to look for remedies. And we're at an interesting cultural moment, because we can see a sort of a paradigm shift taking place in some of the major institutions of our society, in medicine, in education, in business, and in the church. We shouldn't forget that the churches and Christianity as a whole is going through a major reorganization. And one of the signs of this shift of consciousness is a new attraction towards contemplative practices. And these contemplative practices may come in different shapes and sizes and different packages with different labels, some religious, some not religious, some more serious than others. And they promise us a way to recover simplicity. That's what we hope that they will do. The Eastern Orthodox fathers of the Church said that it was like recovering your virginity. It meant recovering this new innocence, this new freshness, this new openness, this new sense of wonder, this new discovery that life can be new. Most of these practices today are embraced by people in a non-religious way. Surprisingly, or not surprisingly perhaps, you're much more likely to be introduced to meditation or different forms of meditation by a therapist or by a doctor than you are by a priest. It's rather strange. You think that meditation has at least a 40,000-year-old history, and all the great religious traditions have incorporated this universal wisdom into their spirituality and into their ideas, into their philosophies or dogma, and yet seem to have lost it, or many of them. For many people, meditation today is something that has been invented quite recently, or found, in the rubbish heap of religion, and rescued, and the religious rust taken off it, and what we have now is the pure science, the pure practical, empirical meditation that works, and it leaves religion safely to one side as either a personal choice or a weekend option or something like that. So this is how we are rediscovering meditation in many areas of modern society. And many religious leaders, certainly in the church, think that the best that they can offer in this crisis, this huge spiritual and cultural crisis that we are in, is to just tell people to come to church. Come to church on Sundays. Then you'll meet a nice group of people who won't challenge you too much, perhaps, and will give you a nice feeling of belonging to a group of like-minded people. And in this situation, we see a major disconnect between the church as one of the great carriers of wisdom in Western society and the rest of society. Many of the contemplative practices that are offered today are presented as effective psychological methods or physical methods or psychophysical exercises which are effective. They calm the mind, they restore a sense of freshness and energy to people who often feel stressed and overburdened and tired or depressed by the conditions under which we live, but are not, in the fullest sense of the spiritual word, transformative. They may reduce stress and distraction, and that is not a bad thing. Nobody could deny that. But in themselves, they rarely point through this first stage to the necessary depth and discipline to bring about a transformative change, a permanent change. Now, that often does happen, of course. Many people will take up some of these practices, be very grateful for them, and have an awakening. They will discover that actually they can live life again with a certain innocence and a certain simplicity and enjoyment. And then the deeper questions, the deeper quest for a spiritual knowledge begins to become conscious. And then they move to another stage, another level. But where does this leave, culturally, where does this leave Julian of Norwich's idea of a condition of complete simplicity costing not less than everything? The danger is that we approach these spiritual practices or these psychological, mental practices in a reductionistic way. We lose a lot of the full comprehensiveness of these spiritual practices in the way that they can touch and transform us as a whole person. And, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, we have always to be on our guard against cheap grace. So, what about this spiritual knowledge that arises from this radical simplicity? Spiritual knowledge is the result of attention, of total attention. In the new theories of the evolution of consciousness, the different stages of consciousness that the world has passed through are triggered. We move to the next stage by a new intensity of attention. We move from the sort of episodic consciousness of just being in the moment and highly aware of what's going on around us, the wild beast in the jungle or the prey that we are trying to hunt. We're very, very attentive to that, but it's a disconnected attention. But then the next stage is where we begin to be able to pay attention to what other people are doing. We learn from the other hunter in the jungle who has developed some technique that we find interesting and we imitate. And so we move from different stages of consciousness through refining and heightening our capacity for attention. And remember this fundamental idea that connects all of this, which is that the essence of prayer is attention. Coming to that total attention is coming to this condition of complete simplicity. But if something costs everything, then you are left with nothing. This is described in two of the great parables of Jesus, where he describes this the kingdom of heaven as like a man who finds a treasure buried in a field. He buries it again, and he sells everything he has and buys the field. So selling everything, a condition of complete simplicity, costing not less than everything. So you don't bargain with this. You know, it's everything. How much is this going to cost? Everything you have. Whether you've got €10 or 10 million euro, it's going to cost everything. And the other parable, which is very similar to it, the merchant looking for fine pearls, who finds one of very great value and sells everything he has and buys it. So this condition of complete simplicity, which comes about through the work of attention, leads us into an experience of emptiness, of nothingness. Remember the fundamental Christian idea of kenosis, the self-emptying of God that takes place in the person of Jesus, and that Jesus repeats, in a sense, in a human form through the story that we're following this week. These incremental layers of suffering, at each one of which we could imagine a new emptying, a new shedding of what he is and what he has. And these expressions of nothingness, of emptiness, or of poverty of spirit, these are favorite expressions of the mystical wisdom of all the traditions. The English mystics used to say, I want nothing, I have nothing, I know nothing. That's a good starting point for meditation. St. Anthony of the Desert describes the monk who prays and who knows that he is praying as not truly praying, because he hasn't yet lost the self-consciousness, that lack of simplicity. But the monk who does not know that he is praying, who has lost that self-consciousness, that divided consciousness, has gained a new simplicity, the unself-consciousness of holiness, that monk knows that is truly praying, because he does not know he is praying. Well, that's exactly what we're doing, moving towards in our daily meditation. This is why John Main tells us, don't evaluate yourself, don't analyze what is happening during your meditation. St. Augustine said, if you can understand it, it isn't God. In other words, that experience of full spiritual knowledge, of full participation in the divine being that we are engineered for, that we're made for, and destined for, this is not something that we can conceptualize. If you're conceptualizing it, analyzing it, thinking about it, you're not there yet. Cassian, as I said, puts it this way. He says, through the faithful repetition of your formula, of your mantra, you renounce all the riches of thought and imagination and come directly into poverty of spirit. John Main was very much on this wavelength of a tradition that taught a response to this absolute call of Jesus to follow him in this way of simplicity. It does not, however, involve destroying what we have, or crushing our desires, or feeling guilty about our pleasures, or becoming fundamentalist in our chosen path. These are all diversions or dangers that we might fall into, and that we need, I think, a sense of tradition and a connection with the community to be able to avoid. Because it's so simple, it's very easy to complicate it. It simply means, in fact, paying full attention. But being single-minded does not mean being narrow-minded. This simple, single-minded, absolute focusing of attention in the Eastern tradition of the Church is called Hezekiah, a word that means stillness or silence of heart. And this Hezekiah, the stillness of mind and heart, is what releases the spiritual knowledge. That is our saving experience, our experience of healing. The word salvation is related to the idea of healing. And it reveals to us that this knowledge is already present within us. It's not, as other forms of knowledge, something that we have to gain by study, by Google searches, by reading or whatever. This knowledge is in fact already present. We call this the mind of Christ, or the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. Remember, the Holy Spirit is the knowledge, the saving knowledge, not objective knowledge, but the saving knowledge that Jesus breathed into his disciples on the morning of the resurrection. Receive the Holy Spirit, he said, and breathed upon them. So this knowledge is already within us, and it is released or activated, or however you want to describe it, by the experience of stillness. We see this in the Psalms. Be still and know that I am God. The stillness brings about this silent, subtle, gentle releasing or arising of this new kind of knowledge. Spiritual knowledge is not an external bank of information or data that we have to access and download. It's described in the scriptures as Christ in you, the hope of a glory to come, or I will be with you until the end of time. It's a knowledge that is interior, a knowledge of presence, but once it has been awakened, it seems to transcend the inner and the outer duality with which we see the world. One of the things that many meditators will say is that they feel that their inner life and their outer life are becoming harmonized or integrated. So the problem for us is not so much the theory, but the practice. And I think we see this in our response to the simplicity of the mantra. John Main used to say, and our community always says, that this obviously is not the only way to heaven or the only way to pray, that grace can work in any manner of different ways, but it is nevertheless a method, a discipline, a practice that is integral to our tradition, one that has always been seen to be useful and available to ordinary people, well, I'd say always, originally, to ordinary people, not to great saints and mystics, but to ordinary people who want, in the course of their chosen way of life, or called way of life, to be open to this depth dimension of themselves and of their faith. So let's just take a moment to think about this simplicity. Remember how John Main said that when we meditate, in this way, we are entering into the passion, into the death and the rising of Jesus. Well, we do that through the work of attention, quite clearly, by saying the mantra, paying attention to the mantra, returning to it as we get distracted. We are being led through a process, a Paschal mystery, a dying and a rising. Dying to self, to ego consciousness, and rising to a deeper, higher awareness that may begin, the first symptom of which may be that you discover that you are addicted to your mobile phone. It's not. This may not. This is a process of awakening. When we first hear about this, we may say, "Yeah, that's a good way of meditation." But always be ready for the but. But it's not the only way. Let's discuss and compare other ways of meditation. And let's see if one of them is better than another. Or let's see if we can practice several at the same time. So there's an acceptance of the simplicity of the practice, but very quickly this simplicity is compromised and avoided by trying to ride too many horses at the same time, or by simply approaching it as an academic or intellectual pursuit in which we are constantly comparing and evaluating different methods. So that's one way that we evade the simplicity. Simplicity is easily lost. Or we say, yeah, this works very well, but actually my circumstances don't allow me to practice it as a discipline. Therefore, discipline isn't really necessary, and I will meditate when I can, when I feel like it. So again, the mantra itself, the work of attention, implies a discipline. And it's the discipline of simplicity, as well as being a simple discipline. And obviously, there are phases in life, or circumstances in life, or certain days when you may not be able to meditate. The question is, have you seen and have you engaged with the fact that simplicity is a discipline? And are you prepared to be humble in the process of learning that discipline? Which is going to involve, for all of us, and fairly regularly, the experience of failure. But we're not discouraged by the failure if we understand what the simplicity of the discipline means. Or other ways we can evade or compromise this simplicity. We accept this simple discipline, this simple teaching, but we spend the next 15 years trying to find the right mantra for me. So we're constantly experimenting, changing the mantra, wondering which one is going to fit and which one's going to open the door miraculously into full, total spiritual knowledge and divinization. Or, there's another common way in which we can evade this challenge of simplicity. We think that And this can take years, actually, to get through. You accept the discipline, you accept the simplicity of it, but you persist in thinking that we should think about the meaning of the mantra. It doesn't matter how many times you hear, let go of your thoughts, or do not think about the meaning of the mantra as you say it. We are so conditioned, our mind is so tuned in to cognitive, imaginative, intellectual, conceptual thinking that we think that the mantra is there really to bring us to nice thoughts or good thoughts. And therefore, of course, we can never really allow the mantra to take us beyond thoughts, to lay aside thoughts, as the Desert Fathers described it. We deny the reality principle that says, let go of the riches of thought and imagination, and you will find more than you ever thought possible or could ever imagine. So we don't actually by denying the reality principle, we block the pleasure principle. So these are a few of the, maybe some of the major ways in which we all, at some point or other, avoid, complicate, compromise the simplicity of the mantra. Now, I'm just making a point here because I think, we're interested in meditation. We're meditating through this week. And I think the theology that we are exploring through our reading of the text and our own reflections on it in our spare time, I'm sure, that theology should not be separated from the practice of prayer at this level. The Desert Fathers used to say, or the Evagrius said, the one who prays is a theologian. So the theology that we are trying to discover within the story that we are exploring, or we are allowing to explore us this week, is going to be a much richer theology, much more experiential theology, if we have personally and interiorly undertaken this work of pure simplicity, of poverty. We're going to connect inevitably with the meaning of the same reality that's being described so powerfully in the story of the last hours of Jesus. So I'm not saying this about this way of meditation to say that it's the only way, or to persuade or criticize any other valid approach. But I'm sort of saying it for the record. There are other approaches to prayer, of course. And yet, let's at least be clear and specific about what is offered to us by the tradition in the poverty of the mantra, and why the mantra can lead us, by a combination of faith and grace, of course, into this experience of spiritual knowledge. In the end, with the gaining of this spiritual knowledge arising from the stillness, the Hezekiah, we discover that experience is the teacher. And the teacher that gets results is the teacher within. Simplicity is the condition in which spiritual knowledge arises. And the spiritual knowledge, remember, is not conceptual knowledge, but it's the direct knowledge that is the Holy Spirit. This is the self-knowledge of God. Who knows God except God's own Spirit, St. Paul says. And this is the Spirit we have received. So we haven't been given ideas about God or second-hand information about God. Jesus hasn't given us a catechism. He's breathed into us this direct sharing, this direct participation in the self-knowledge of God. This is our divinization. The more we open ourselves to this, the more we allow it to change us, little by little, or at whatever speed the Spirit chooses, the more we are transformed. The process of learning is a way of life. And this is why we understand the difference between a discipline and a technique. A discipline, a technique is something which can be very effective and very good to develop in many areas of life. But a technique is something that has a specific goal, a specific desired result. We want to be able to do this or do that, or gain this knowledge. And a technique is something, therefore, which is always being evaluated as an instrument, as a tool, and something that the ego, in a good way, is using. But a discipline is a very different approach. We may be doing the same thing, or we may be doing it as a discipline or as a technique. I think most of us begin by meditating as a technique. That's why we feel we're not doing it very well, and we feel we're not a good meditator and so on. But with practice, with the experience that comes with the job, you begin to shift from being a technician using a technique to being a disciple who is practicing a discipline. Now, that shift is going to be your story. How that happens is part of you. But it's, I think, the same process of a spiritual journey for all of us. So the simplicity is the condition in which spiritual knowledge arises, and the process of learning is actually a process of simplification itself, which at times, as all simplification does, involves reduction and loss. If your house is a mess and the stuff accumulated over the years that you've stuffed into cupboards and under your bed and lying around in a mess everywhere, and you finally want to tidy it up, well, you won't tidy it up without throwing some stuff away. There's a process of purification, process of reduction. But when we see and feel the meaning of this, it's not so hard. It actually is a joyful and a liberating thing. Meditation and the simplicity of the mantra teaches us to exercise this simplicity by letting go of all the complexities of our thoughts and feelings at the time of meditation. But the influence of this practice, morning and evening, is increasingly felt in every aspect of our lives. It gives a new meaning and immediacy to our experience of the wholeness and the presence of God in our lives. I think this idea of simplicity, which we try to open ourselves to and try to practice in our meditation, is at the heart of this story of of the Easter, of the Paschal story. We see Jesus challenged at many places in the story to either remain in this process of reduction, of simplification, or to run, or to complicate, or to react in anger. And in each of these moments where he is challenged, tested, and suffers through into a new level of consciousness, he pays attention. He's steady. He maintains his focus. Let's just listen to this section of the story from Matthew. Then all the disciples deserted him and ran away. Quite a major reduction of his sense of self. Jesus was led off under arrest to the house of Caiaphas the high priest, where the lawyers and elders were assembled. The high priest rose and said to him, "Have you no answer to the charge that these witnesses bring against you," all the false witnesses? But Jesus kept silence. So let us keep silence now. We could take a couple of minutes